Esther was no stranger to exploring eerie, abandoned places. As a photographer, she sought out locations that were lost to time, places that whispered stories through broken windows and decaying walls. So, when she heard rumors of an abandoned carnival on the outskirts of a small, nearly forgotten town, she couldn't resist. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning that it was cursed after a tragic accident years ago. They claimed that the spirits of the performers and visitors still roamed the grounds, trapped in an eternal loop of terror. But Esther dismissed the warnings as mere superstition. She wanted to capture the desolation of the place with her camera. Arriving at dusk, Esther parked her car at the edge of the overgrown field that bordered the carnival grounds. The sky was a deep shade of purple, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and rust. In the distance, she could see the outline of the old Ferris wheel, its metal skeleton silhouetted against the darkening sky. Tattered tents flapped gently in the breeze, and broken signs lay scattered across the entrance, half buried in weeds. She approached the entrance cautiously, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. The gates, once brightly painted, were now coated in a thick layer of grime, their hinges groaning as she pushed them open. A chill ran down her spine, but she shook it off, telling herself it was just the wind. She stepped through the gates, her footsteps crunching on broken glass and debris. The carnival stretched out before her, a desolate wasteland of twisted metal and decaying wood. As she ventured deeper, she felt an eerie stillness settle over the grounds. It was as if the air had grown thicker, pressing down on her shoulders. She set up her camera and began to take photos, capturing the haunting beauty of the rusted rides and faded signs. But as she clicked the shutter, she heard a faint sound, like the distant tinkling of music. She paused, straining to listen. There it was again, a faint melody drifting through the air, followed by the faintest hint of laughter. Esther frowned, lowering her camera. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty grounds. There was no reply, just the wind rustling through the dilapidated tents. She shook her head and continued her exploration, but the unease in her gut only grew stronger. Esther made her way through the carnival, her eyes drawn to the towering structure of the funhouse. Its entrance was adorned with a grotesque, grinning clown face, the paint peeling off in jagged strips. The eyes seemed to follow her as she approached, a lingering gaze that sent a shiver down her spine. Ignoring her instinct to turn back, she stepped inside. The interior was pitch black, the air musty and cold. She flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal cracked mirrors lining the walls. The reflections stared back at her, twisted and distorted, each one a grotesque parody of her own face. The floorboards creaked under her weight as she ventured further, the sound echoing through the narrow corridor. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows along the walls. Esther cursed under her breath, tapping the flashlight to steady the beam. That's when she heard it, a soft, childlike giggle coming from somewhere deep within the funhouse. She froze, her heart pounding. She was certain she was alone. She had been the only one at the entrance. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. The giggling stopped, replaced by the sound of something scraping against the floor. Her breath hitched as she turned, swinging the flashlight around to catch a glimpse of movement at the end of the hallway. In the dim light, she could make out a small figure darting into a side room, the flash of pale skin and dark hair sending a jolt of fear through her. Esther hesitated, every fiber of her being screaming at her to leave. But curiosity, or perhaps sheer stubbornness, pushed her forward. She moved toward the room where the figure had disappeared, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. The whispers in her mind grew louder, urging her to stop, to turn back. Yet, she pushed the door open, revealing a small chamber filled with broken carnival props and faded posters. The room was empty, save for the cracked mirrors that lined the walls, each one reflecting her pale, terrified face. For a moment, she let out a shaky breath of relief. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, an illusion created by the distorted mirrors. But then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the reflection of the mirror, behind her, stood a clown, a figure in faded, tattered costume, its face contorted into a grotesque smile. Esther spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, yet the reflection in the mirror remained. The clown grinning back at her with eyes that gleamed with malevolent glee. Esther stumbled out of the funhouse, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what she had seen, but the image of the grinning clown in the mirror haunted her. She glanced around, her eyes darting to the other attractions scattered across the carnival grounds. Her gaze settled on the carousel, its once bright and colorful horses now faded and cracked. The air around it seemed thicker, colder, as if the carousel itself held onto the remnants of the past. With trembling hands, she raised her camera, snapping a few pictures. The carousel stood motionless, its paint peeling and the wooden horses frozen in mid-gallop. She moved closer, drawn to the center where the control panel lay covered in rust. The platform creaked beneath her feet, the sound echoing eerily in the silent carnival. As she reached the control panel, a faint melody began to play, the haunting chime of a music box filling the air. Esther froze, her heart skipping a beat. The carousel began to move, the horses jolting forward in a slow, rhythmic motion. She stared in disbelief, her mind screaming that this was impossible. The carnival had been abandoned for decades. There was no power source to operate the rides. The music grew louder, a twisted version of a cheerful carnival tune. Laughter echoed around her, soft at first, then growing louder, more frenzied. She spun around, searching for the source, but the grounds were empty. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, flitting between the rusted attractions. Panic surged within her, and she backed away from the carousel. As she did, she noticed the horses' eyes glinting in the dim light, their heads turning slowly to watch her. She felt her legs weaken, threatening to buckle under the weight of her fear. The laughter swirled around her, a cacophony of voices that filled her mind with a crushing sense of dread. She stumbled back, gasping for air, her mind reeling. The carnival was alive, filled with the echoes of those who had once been here, their souls trapped in an endless loop of horror and despair. And now, it wanted her to join them. Esther turned and ran from the carousel, her heart hammering in her chest. The laughter continued to echo around her, a chaotic mixture of voices that made her skin crawl. She sprinted toward the next attraction, her eyes darting around for any sign of escape. As she rounded a corner, she found herself standing before the Hall of Mirrors. The building loomed in front of her, its entrance framed by broken lights and faded posters of contorted faces. Cracked, stained glass lined the front, reflecting distorted images of the carnival grounds. Esther hesitated, feeling a wave of nausea at the sight of the twisted reflections. It was as if the mirrors were mocking her, warping reality into something grotesque. She swallowed hard and stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind her. The room was dark and cold, the only light coming from small, flickering bulbs along the ceiling. The mirrors inside stretched from floor to ceiling, forming a maze of reflections that twisted and multiplied in every direction. Esther moved cautiously through the labyrinth, her flashlight beam bouncing off the mirrored walls and creating a dizzying array of shapes. She tried to keep her eyes forward, focusing on finding a way out, but the reflections drew her gaze, each one showing something different. Some mirrors reflected her as she was, pale, eyes wide with fear. Others showed distorted versions, her face elongated into a scream or melting into shadow. Suddenly, one reflection caught her eye. It showed not just her, but another figure standing behind her, a child in a faded carnival costume, staring at her with dark, hollow eyes. She spun around, her heart lurching, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, yet in the mirror, the child remained, its expression changing to a sinister grin. Esther backed away, her breath coming in short gasps. The mirrors around her began to warp, the images shifting and changing. Now, every reflection showed her surrounded by shadowy figures, their hands reaching out toward her, mouths open in silent screams. She stumbled backward, feeling the cold glass press against her spine. The whispers started then, soft and insistent. "Stay with us," they murmured, voices blending into a hypnotic chant. The mirrors seemed to pulse with a life of their own, drawing her in, surrounding her with the faces of the forgotten souls trapped within. Esther shut her eyes, fighting the urge to scream. She had to get out, had to escape this nightmare. With a surge of adrenaline, she turned and sprinted through the maze, ignoring the disorienting reflections and the whispering voices that filled her ears. Her hands groped for an exit, and finally, she found a door. She pushed through it, bursting out into the open air, the sound of laughter and whispers fading behind her. She doubled over, gasping for breath, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. Esther stumbled forward, trying to clear her head. She looked around, desperately searching for a way out of the carnival. Her eyes landed on a large tent nearby, its once bright stripes now faded and torn. She hesitated, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. It was the clown's tent, the centerpiece of the carnival's past performances. Despite her fear, she felt a pull toward it, an inexplicable urge to see what was inside. Gritting her teeth, she made her way to the tent, pushing through the flaps and stepping into the darkness beyond. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something metallic, like rust or blood. The interior was vast, the floor covered in layers of dust and debris. Broken chairs and shattered props lay scattered around, remnants of a show long forgotten. In the center of the tent stood a small stage, its curtains half torn, revealing a glimpse of darkness behind them. Esther approached the stage, her footsteps muffled by the dirt beneath her feet. The atmosphere grew heavier, a sense of dread filling the air. As she reached the edge, she saw them. Clown mannequins, positioned around the stage in various poses, their painted faces cracked and faded. Their eyes, glassy and lifeless, seemed to follow her every move. The tent grew colder, and the silence pressed against her ears. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, the sound of a music box filled the air, its haunting melody drifting through the darkness. Esther froze, feeling a chill run down her spine. The mannequins began to move, their limbs creaking as they turned toward her, their mouths opening in a grotesque smile. A voice echoed through the tent, deep and distorted. The show must go on, it crooned, sending a wave of terror through her. Esther backed away, her eyes wide with horror as the mannequins climbed off the stage, their movements jerky and unnatural. The air around her grew dense, filled with the sound of laughter and music, blending into a cacophony that made her head spin. She stumbled, falling to the ground, her hands scraping against the dirt. The mannequins loomed over her, their grinning faces descending closer. In a final act of desperation, she grabbed a broken piece of wood from the ground and swung it wildly, scattering the mannequins. They recoiled, retreating back toward the stage. Esther scrambled to her feet, running out of the tent and back into the open air. The laughter followed her, echoing through the fairgrounds as she sprinted away, her heart pounding in her chest. Esther continued to flee, her heart racing as she put distance between herself and the clown's tent. The laughter echoed in her ears, growing fainter with each step. She knew she couldn't keep running aimlessly. She needed to find a way out of this nightmare. Her eyes scanned the carnival grounds, settling on the towering Ferris wheel looming ahead. It stood tall and still, its rusted frame creaking softly in the wind. She approached cautiously, her breath ragged from fear and exhaustion. The wheel's cabins hung precariously, swaying in the breeze. A cold dread settled over her, but an inexplicable pull urged her to move closer. As she reached the base of the wheel, she noticed something. A small, faint light flickering in one of the cabins high above. She squinted, her pulse quickening. The light bobbed slightly, like a candle flame in the dark. With a deep breath, Esther stepped into the control booth at the base of the Ferris wheel. Dust covered the panel, and most of the levers and buttons were rusted and unresponsive. Only one button seemed to glow faintly, a sickly green light pulsating beneath the grime. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the button. The air around her felt charged, buzzing with a strange energy. Against her better judgment, she pressed the button. The wheel groaned, its gears grinding painfully to life. The cabins jolted, swaying as the wheel began to turn. Esther backed away, eyes fixed on the lit cabin as it slowly descended toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of terror and curiosity surging through her veins. The wheel creaked louder, filling the air with an eerie symphony of rusted metal. As the cabin reached ground level, it stopped abruptly, the doors swinging open with a loud, echoing creak. Esther approached cautiously, peering inside. To her surprise, the interior was pristine, untouched by time. A single candle burned on the small table, casting flickering shadows on the walls. She stepped inside, feeling an immediate drop in temperature. The door slammed shut behind her, causing her to jump. The cabin jolted and began to rise, the Ferris wheel turning on its own accord. Esther grabbed the metal frame, her knuckles turning white. She glanced outside, the carnival grounds shrinking below her as the wheel ascended. Her reflection in the glass grew faint, replaced by shadowy figures standing in the seats around her, their faces obscured. The air grew thick with whispers, voices overlapping each other in a chaotic murmur. Esther pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the noise, but it was futile. The voices grew louder, each one pleading, crying, and laughing in a symphony of madness. The cabin reached the top of the wheel, stopping abruptly. Outside, the carnival lay shrouded in darkness, save for the faint glow of the candle inside the cabin. Suddenly, the voices ceased, plunging the cabin into a heavy silence. Esther's breath came in short gasps as she turned her head, eyes locking onto the flickering candle. In its flame, she saw shapes, faces distorted in horror, mouths open in silent screams. She recoiled, pressing herself against the cold glass of the cabin. The flame flared, casting the shadows of those trapped within the carnival onto the walls around her. As the Ferris wheel descended and the cabin door swung open, Esther stumbled out, her legs weak and shaky. She could barely think, her mind clouded by the visions and whispers she had just endured. She took a few deep breaths, trying to steady herself. The wind carried faint music to her ears, drawing her gaze toward the center of the carnival where the freak show tent loomed. The tent stood larger than the others, its striped canvas sagging and torn. Curiosity mingled with fear as Esther moved toward it, feeling as though she was being pulled by an unseen force. The entrance was marked with faded posters, each depicting figures with grotesque, exaggerated features, performers who had once thrilled audiences with their abnormalities. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the scent of mildew. Rows of benches lined the tent, facing a small stage that lay covered in dust and cobwebs. Esther crept forward, her eyes scanning the shadowy corners. A collection of cages and props stood at the back, half hidden in darkness. As she approached, she noticed an old trunk resting against the stage, its lid partially open. With a trembling hand, she lifted the lid, revealing a stack of photographs and papers. She picked one up, her eyes widening at the sight. The photograph was of the carnival's performers, their faces contorted in expressions of agony. Scrawled across the image were the words, "They never left." Esther rifled through the papers, finding diary entries from the performers. They spoke of a curse, an accident during a show that had unleashed something evil into the carnival. One entry caught her eye, describing a ritual that the performers had attempted to break the curse, but had failed. Their souls had been trapped, forced to reenact the horror of that night over and over again. As she read, the tent grew colder, and a low murmur filled the air. She glanced up to see shadows moving in the corners, shifting and coalescing into the forms of the performers. Their faces were pale and twisted, eyes hollow and mouths stretched into unnatural grins. They moved toward her, their limbs jerking in puppet-like motions. Esther backed away, clutching the papers to her chest. The performers encircled her, their whispers rising in a haunting chant. "Join us," they crooned, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that sent chills down her spine. Desperate to escape, Esther broke free from the circle and fled out of the tent. Her footsteps pounded against the earth as she sprinted across the carnival grounds. Her eyes darted around, searching for an exit, but the shadows of the attractions loomed like sentinels, blocking her path. In her frantic dash, She stumbled upon the entrance to the Tunnel of Love, its faded heart-shaped archway twisted into a grim, almost mocking expression. The tunnel was dark, the interior illuminated only by the faint, flickering lights strung along the walls. She hesitated, but the approaching shadows left her no choice. Taking a deep breath, she plunged inside, the darkness swallowing her whole. The tunnel echoed with the sound of dripping water and distant, disembodied laughter. As she moved forward, the walls began to change, reflecting scenes from her own memories. She saw herself as a child, lost in a crowd, then as a teenager, standing alone in a school hallway. The images twisted and blurred, morphing into nightmares, faces of loved ones turning pale and lifeless, hands reaching out from the darkness to drag her down. She shook her head, trying to dispel the images. "It's not real," she whispered to herself, clutching her arms to stop them from trembling. But the tunnel seemed to feed on her fear, amplifying it until she could barely breathe. Shadows reached out from the walls, fingers stretching toward her, clawing at her clothes. Esther forced herself to push forward through the tunnel, her mind racing as the shadows clawed at her from all sides. Her body trembled, and it felt as if the walls were closing in, squeezing the breath from her lungs. The dripping sounds echoed through the narrow passage, and the dim lights flickered, casting distorted shadows that danced along the walls. She stumbled, catching herself against the damp tunnel wall. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a large chamber at the end. In the center of the room stood an old ticket booth, its glass shattered, and a dim light pulsed within it, like a heartbeat. Around the booth, scattered across the floor, were old ticket stubs and torn pieces of fabric, relics of the carnival's dark past. Esther approached cautiously, her breath catching in her throat as she neared the booth. The air around her grew colder, the shadows coiling around her feet like snakes. Inside the booth, a figure sat slumped over, barely visible in the flickering light. Esther's heart pounded as she realized it was the carnival's ringmaster, his skeletal frame still clad in a tattered suit, his top hat tilted precariously on his head. In his bony hands, he held a stack of tickets, each one marked with a faded, blood-red stamp. His face, a mask of frozen terror, stared directly at her with empty eye sockets. As she reached the booth, the ringmaster's head jerked up, and the entire chamber was filled with a cacophony of laughter, music, and screams. Esther stumbled back, covering her ears, but the noise only grew louder. The ringmaster moved mechanically, holding out a ticket toward her, his jaw opening and closing in a silent, twisted mockery of speech. "The last ticket," a voice whispered in her mind, clear and sharp amid the chaos. "The final price to escape the carnival's curse." Esther realized then that the ticket was an invitation, one that could either seal her fate within the carnival or grant her a chance to break free. Her hand trembled as she reached out to take the ticket. The shadows around her closed in, tightening their grip as if sensing her intention. With a surge of resolve, she snatched the ticket from the ringmaster's hand. The booth shuddered violently, the glass shattering as the ringmaster let out a silent scream. The shadows recoiled, swirling around the chamber in a frenzied dance. Clutching the ticket, Esther backed away from the booth. She felt a rush of cold wind push against her, nearly knocking her off balance. The chamber grew darker, the walls vibrating as if about to collapse. She turned and ran, sprinting back through the tunnel, the laughter and whispers chasing her as she fled. Esther burst out of the tunnel, stumbling onto the carnival grounds. She looked around frantically, searching for the exit. The shadows swirled around the attractions, writhing and stretching toward her like the tendrils of a nightmare. Her eyes locked onto the main gate in the distance, the twisted metal archway barely visible through the swirling darkness. With the ticket gripped tightly in her hand, she ran, her legs burning with each stride. The carnival seemed to warp around her, the ground shifting under her feet, but she refused to stop. The whispers grew louder, the laughter turning into a chorus of screams that filled her ears, urging her to look back, to succumb to the terror. But she pressed forward, focused on the gate ahead. As she neared the exit, the shadows around her closed in, the ground trembling as if trying to pull her down. Esther pushed harder, her heart pounding in her chest. The gate loomed closer, its hinges rusted and creaking in the wind. With a final, desperate lunge, she reached the gate and slammed the ticket into the metal latch. The carnival ground erupted in a howl of wind and noise. A blinding flash of light engulfed her, and for a moment, everything went silent. Esther felt herself falling, spinning through a void of darkness. Then, just as suddenly, the world snapped back into place, and she collapsed onto solid ground, gasping for breath. She opened her eyes to find herself lying outside the carnival gates, the fog lifting as dawn began to break. The carnival behind her stood silent, its once haunting presence now diminished in the early morning light. Esther staggered to her feet, her body aching and her mind reeling. She glanced down at her hand. The ticket was gone, leaving only a faint mark on her palm. The air around her felt different, lighter. The carnival's hold on her had broken. She had escaped, but as she turned to walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that a part of the carnival had followed her, that its laughter and whispers would forever echo in the corners of her mind. If this tale of the abandoned carnival gave you chills, make sure to hit subscribe for more spine-tingling stories of the paranormal. Don't forget to ring the notification bell to join us on our next journey into the unknown. Have you ever felt drawn to a place that seemed haunted by its past? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up to let us know. Remember, some places are best left forgotten,